Estamos en vivo.
Hola, buenas tardes. Continuamos en las jornadas argentinas de didáctica en ciencias de la computación. Soy Hernán, a lo mejor algunos me vieron ayer, y bueno, si no me vieron, soy Hernán Chaverinsky de la Fundación Sadowski de la iniciativa Programar. Vamos a arrancar ahora con una de las keynotes. Esta la va a estar dando Annette Vee. Para mí es un gran placer estar presentándola. Annette es investigadora y profesora asociada de inglés y directora del programa de composición en la Universidad de Pittsburgh, donde da cursos de grado y también de posgrado sobre escritura, composición digital y alfabetización. Sus temas de investigación se encuentran en la intersección de la escritura y la computación. Estudia cómo la tecnología computacional está interviniendo en ámbitos que tradicionalmente pertenecían al campo de la retórica, del derecho y el comercio, entre otros. Actualmente está trabajando en proyectos que consideran formas en las que las personas han intentado automatizar la escritura a través de medios mecánicos y computacionales. También hace investigación sobre la historia de los lenguajes de programación y cómo las tecnologías inciden tanto en la escritura como en la enseñanza de la escritura. En investigaciones anteriores exploró el uso de blogs en educación en modalidad híbrida, el papel de los bots en línea para difundir noticias falsas, las conexiones entre la computación y la retórica, y el estatus que tiene la escritura de programas en relación a derechos de autor y patentes. Su trabajo se utiliza en decenas de cursos universitarios que tratan sobre alfabetización, composición, estudios textuales, humanidades digitales y educación en informática. En 2007, Annette publicó el libro Coding Literacy, que da cuenta de cómo ciertas herramientas teóricas utilizadas en la investigación sobre alfabetización pueden ayudar a comprender la programación. Hoy Annette está con nosotros para hablar sobre las conexiones que hay entre la programación y la alfabetización. En la última década se fue instalando la idea de que la programación tiene que formar parte del proceso de alfabetización que se desarrolla en el transcurso escolar, del mismo modo que lo son la lectura y la escritura. Esto además se fue fortaleciendo por la idea de que estas habilidades abren un camino a una potencial carrera lucrativa en el ámbito laboral. Sin embargo, el argumento de que la programación en computadoras se encuentre disponible para todos existió desde al menos la década del 50. ¿Cuáles son las justificaciones para estos argumentos de que todos deberían aprender a programar? ¿Cómo han cambiado con el tiempo y qué significado y qué significa todo esto para los educadores en ciencias de la computación? Bueno, durante su charla, Annette va a recorrer las distintas respuestas a estas preguntas que fueron surgiendo a lo largo del tiempo. Annette, muchísimas gracias por estar con nosotros y cuando quieras puedes empezar con tu charla.
Thank you so much, Hernan, for the wonderful introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, can everybody see that?
Sí, yes.
Yes, okay. And you can hear me, excellent. Well, so this is my talk, Coding and Literacy Connections. Hernan already said a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today. I'll say a little bit more just to introduce it. But first, I want to say thank you to the Sadowski Foundation, to Hernan, Marcos, and Nicolas, who originally connected me here. And then also to Romina and Sandra for making me understandable to all of you, hopefully. So thank you all for being here very much. I really, I'm excited to be here and talk with you all. So to introduce myself, in addition to what Hernan said, I write about coding and writing. I work at the University of Pittsburgh, and I used to teach English in a US high school. So I'm coming from originally from a K through 12 context here in the United States. This is a little bit more detail about my background. I used to work in the game industry. I learned initial programming on a Commodore 64, and basic programming, which is something I've done a little bit of history on too, if you all are curious in the Q&A. I used to teach at Jefferson High School in Illinois in the Midwest in the United States. And I have 3 kids. Those are my 3 kids there. So those are just kind of a background to who I am and where I'm coming from. I'm also, this is Pittsburgh, just so you know where I am. Virtual conferences right now are wonderful. They can be a little disorienting, but this is where I am. And in fact, you can see that's the Cathedral of Learning on the right. That's the building I'm literally in right now. That's where my office is. And the little arrow is approximately where I am. It's a very tall educational building, and it's an interesting place to work. So that's me in Pittsburgh. And the talk that I'm going to give today is based mostly on, as Hernan said, my book, Coding Literacy, which came out with MIT Press in 2017. It's based on the research that I did in this book. And because you all program and you know a number of different computer languages, I'm sure, maybe you recognize some of the languages on this cover. If you do recognize them, go ahead and type them in the chat. There are 17 different languages here. They are roughly in chronological order. So you may recognize some of them. Some of them are interpreted languages. Some of them are Turing complete. Some of them are toy languages. And I would love to know your take on these. So what I'll talk about today, 3 different main sections to my talk. First, the current push for coding for everyone, or what I call coding literacy, and what a lot of people call coding literacy, actually. That connection between coding and literacy, at least in English, is made quite frequently. And the connections to the history of mass literacy. I come from literacy studies as my original training. When I got my doctorate, I learned a lot about how people learn to read and write, how reading and writing works in the world, and the history of reading and writing. And so I used that history in order to think through what it meant when everybody was saying that we should all have coding literacy. And then I'll say something about the history of coding literacy beginning in the 1960s, actually beginning in 1959, which is the first instance that I've seen where somebody said that everybody should learn to code, not just specialists. And the goal ultimately is to give you a picture of the long tradition of coding and literacy. And this is perhaps just a context maybe for you to see your own position in this history and in this legacy, and where you're teaching, and all of the teachers and the movements that came before you. So the first section is about everyone can and should code. And let me just check the chat a little bit. Did anybody? Oh, I see some languages in here. Yes, C++, there's HTML, Pascal, COBOL. COBOL was one of my favorites for sure to put in there. That was fun. Thank you for putting in your guesses there. Okay, so first section, everyone can and should code. And that's what people in education and government are all saying. You may have heard this yourself. You may be part of this movement. You may have said this yourself even. So this is one of the, hold on just a second, I lost my notes. Oop, that's not what I want. Hold on a second, I'm going to reshare. Because I lost. It's not what I want. Okay, hopefully you can see my sharing again now, right? So this is code.org is probably an organization that you've heard of because it has been very popular in terms of how it's promoting coding throughout the globe. Actually, it's been focused on the United States, and it's been really successful in the US in getting more computer science into the curriculum. And so they've made videos where they argue for coding as a kind of literacy. They say things like, if you haven't learned to code, then it's basically like you don't know how to read and write. And if you don't know how to code, then you'll be left behind, just like people who were illiterate have been left behind. So they use this same kind of rhetoric in order to make the arguments about coding. So other educational scholars make similar arguments about people who need to learn to code in order to survive in jobs and in life. And in the US, these arguments have been really successful in getting more computer science into the formal curriculum into schools. So this is Douglas Rushkoff, who is an American educational theorist, and he said very memorably, program or be programmed. So in other words, either you know how to code or other people are going to program you, they're going to control you. So that has been a very memorable tagline in the United States. Another one is Mark Prensky. He says, as programming becomes more important, it will leave the back room and become a key skill and attribute of our top intellectual and social classes, just as reading and writing did in the past. So it's not only a literacy, but it's also something that elite people will be able to do, that the better you know how to do this, the more elite you will be in our social classes. And then this is the former, this is the New York City mayor back in 2015, saying that he was announcing a computer science program and other initiatives for New York City public school students. And this was one of the first of the initiatives really trying to get it into public schools in the United States. But since 2015, a number of public schools, including some in Pittsburgh, have really been pushing for it. And there's been formal integration into schools and also in after-school programs and things like that. So, and there are lots of different coding languages and programs aimed at young people. Most of these are free and available online. I'm sure you know some of these. These are some of the organizations in the United States that are very common: Code Academy, Black Girls Code, which is one that's aimed specifically at Black girls here in the United States who are very underrepresented in technology companies. And in advanced computer science classes in high school. And so a lot of these groups focus on underrepresented minorities. Also, Yes, We Code is another one of those that's similarly focused on underrepresented minorities. A number of these places promise that something like become a software engineer in 9 to 12 months. And these are often called coding boot camps, very sort of quick ways of getting certified to code and to get a good job. There's a lot of things aimed at children too. I'm sure you're familiar with some of these little toys and robots and really cool toys for kids, which some of my kids have occasionally played with as well. Lego Mindstorms, which was influenced by Seymour Papert. This is one of them. This is another game. There's just tons of things. I'm sure you've seen a number of these. Alice, which is a programming language you may have seen too. So lots of different, and Scratch, lots of different kinds of coding languages. So to prompt my talk, these are all things you're probably familiar with because you live in this space and you're teaching in this space. But why are we talking about coding for everyone now? Like, what is it right now in 2021 that's making this really compelling, or beginning, say, somewhere around 2013 when this really became very popular with Code.org's Hour of Code? And one of the reasons is that programming is profitable, both personally and nationally. So people can make money off of it. This is some of the rhetoric behind the coding boot camps. And so they can make money off of it personally, and also it benefits nations. So this is one reason why the United States is pushing it as a national level or by states, or also why Argentina is also pushing it nationally, and many other countries. But a few other reasons. So one is just that we live in code. Like everything we do now is filtered through code. And I think that this is even more accentuated with the pandemic and the fact that most of our contact through education, at least, but many, a lot of it through our jobs, through teaching, through how we get to even conferences, is all through Zoom or through similar platforms. And so that means that it's all digitally filtered through. And so knowing a little bit about coding, about security, about how packet switching works on the internet, and lots of different technical things that are related to coding, those have become even more relevant as we are living more and more in code than we ever have been before. But also there's positive ways of thinking. And so this is computational thinking. And this Seymour Papert is kind of one of the original ideas or thinkers behind this, that coding helps us think in new ideas and new ways, that computers are objects to think with, that they help us see the world in new ways and think more complex thoughts. And here are a couple other references, these last names, to people who have also done this kind of work. Creativity in code. Here's another one of my favorite reasons why people are talking about how everyone should learn to code, is that everyone should have access to this kind of medium. It's like having access to paint or to something to draw. You can do lots of fun things in code. And this is something I'm sure I don't have to tell you, but there's art and creative things you can do with writing, lots of different things. And another reason is access and equity. And so this is one of the things that the groups that are aimed at underrepresented minorities are extremely invested in. And that is the fact that all over the world, people with more money, more power, more access to educational resources of higher classes, more elite, are the ones who are doing the programming, and they are the ones designing the software. And that means that their concerns, their interests are the ones that are being represented in the software that's made. In the United States, that's disproportionately white men. And that's often the case elsewhere in the globe too. So this is a problem, that programming is done by a narrow segment of the population, both nationally, in the United States at least, and globally. So code.org, this is one of the reasons why they're particularly invested in this. And I'm going to keep referring to code.org in some ways because it's the most prominent promoter of coding literacy here in the United States, and because it has an international presence. It has a lot of videos and ways of learning. But of course, again, as I said earlier, there's a number of different places that do this kind of work. So they note that they're thinking about diversity across all of their students in their courses, and how we might, what are some reasons why we might want to get, in particular, women and Black and Hispanic students in the United States more into advanced computer science courses. In the United States, this is what the graph looks like for women in computer science. So the women in computer science is the red line across the graph. And as you can see, across the physical sciences, law school, medical school, these other places where women were once underrepresented have gone up over the years, but the red line has gone down. And so in the United States, since the mid-1980s, there were fewer and fewer women involved in computer science. And so this is a kind of strange trend that doesn't follow the other ones. And so it makes us think a little bit about why that's the case. Because there were women in the beginning of computing. So this is a picture from Bletchley Park from World War II, from the UK. This was, the women were part of the UK war effort in World War II. And they were in the United States too. These are ENIAC programmers in the United States. And there was a very popular movie here in the United States recently, Hidden Figures, that was based on a book by Margot Shetterly that featured women, particularly Black women programmers, who helped do the programming to get the first astronauts to the moon in the 1960s in the United States. So we know about these things for coding, and we know now some of the arguments about why we might want to have more people coding or programming. So let's look at how we got to mass literacy. If we're truly going to have mass programming or mass coding, then we can look at mass literacy as an example of how we got there. Because actually, mass literacy across the world looks pretty good. In most developed countries, literacy rates are 95% and higher, very high. We often see women's literacy rates lower than men's in certain countries, depending, which tends to correlate with women's rights and other things. But generally, literacy rates across the globe are quite good, and certainly in the United States and Argentina, that's the case. And women's literacy rates often kind of lagged behind men's historically, too. This was almost always the case, at least in Europe and in the US throughout the 19th century, which also had to do with women's rights and education and who was able to get schooling. So historically, the main motivation for textual literacy, for alphabetic literacy, was religious. So this is Martin Luther posting the 95 Theses in 1517, which set off the Protestant Reformation. And there were a lot of other technological developments after that to make books and pamphlets and things like that. But this is the Gutenberg Press, which was developed in 1450. So this was just before Martin Luther. So a lot of the theories about Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation are that they were in some ways kind of helped along or encouraged by the increase of textual materials and the printing press beginning in the 15th century in Germany, which led then to more people reading about religion, more people reading the Bible, and then kind of led to the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther's leadership there, and people wanting to access text and access God through texts directly rather than indirectly, as was the case in the Catholic Church. So all of the other technological developments after the printing press, such as better paper and better ink and more industrialized processes in the 19th century also contributed to the increase in the availability of text. But beginning in about the 16th, 17th century, once written materials were more available through printing, then more people had the opportunity to learn to read. And so the availability of all of these texts then sort of preceded the ability for people to learn to read, because it was hard to learn to read if there weren't texts around first. So this is a quote I really appreciate from some literacy historians, Ferret and Ozef, in France, which is Luther made necessary what Gutenberg made possible. And by that, what they mean is Martin Luther made it necessary for people to be able to read, and Gutenberg made it possible for people to read. And the way that Martin Luther made it necessary for people to read was that they needed to be able to read to access salvation through the Protestant church and the Protestant beliefs. So in order to be connected to God, people had to be able to read the Bible. So this was a powerful motivation for literacy. If you needed to learn to read in order to go to heaven, to access God, to be saved, then people were much more motivated to learn to read. So mass literacy was spread by the Protestant church, but the Catholic church then followed shortly afterwards, because since people were demanding it from the Protestant church, then they also wanted that. If they were Catholic, they wanted it from their church too. So churches were the first kind of groups that ended up supporting schooling in the more formal ways in order to kind of keep up and keep parents and communities giving them access to literacy and to books and to the ability to read and write. So it took, though, not only the availability of printing, but it also took schooling in order to make literacy possible. Early schools in Europe looked like this. They were informal, and they were taught by itinerant schoolmasters, just schoolmasters who would wander around from little village to little village. They would teach kids for 6 months or so, and then they would get basic literacy from these schoolmasters, and then they would move on. So a lot of the literacy was just very, very basic A, B, C kind of literacy. And some of these schoolmasters had very little training themselves and could sometimes barely write and read themselves. So it took a long time for formal schooling to be implemented. And in most of Europe and the United States, it wasn't until the 19th century that formal schooling was very common. So this is what formal schooling looked like at the end of the 19th century in the US. We had one-room schoolhouses where everybody from a little community would be all across ages, and they would be working on different kinds of things together. And in the 19th century, there was still informal schooling too. So there were a lot of images of reading in the 19th century that looked like this, that were a little bit more formalized. It was passed down by mothers. Mothers were thought of as kind of perpetuating citizenship and feeling responsible for educating their kids in order to support their own moral development. So it wasn't always religious at this time, but it was a moral good to be literate. That meant you were a good person if you were literate. And so these are good kids who are behaving very well by listening to their mother and learning how to read. So that was when, in the 19th century, in most of the West, is where when we would say this is really when mass literacy hit, when there was enough people who knew how to read and write, that newspapers were very popular, and lots of very popular kinds of texts were circulating. This was a good way to get news or to publish books or things like that. So the 19th century is really when mass literacy was big across the globe. And so now, literacy is something that everybody supports. So even politicians who don't agree, they often agree that kids should learn to read. So it tends to be a little bit less political than some other arguments about education. There's lots of promotion of reading. That means it's very morally good. So the Read campaign is a popular campaign in US libraries that features famous actors, politicians, sports stars, et cetera. And this is just a few pictures of American stars that are being promoted. And you often see these posters up in US libraries promoting reading for children. So around World War II in the United States, literacy became more about how it was good for the nation. So this is a kind of shift. So initially this was good for religion. It was good for your moral development to be able to learn to read. But there's a kind of shift, at least in the United States, and this is common, I think, across other nations too. It was still good for individuals for moral and religious reasons to be literate, but it became additionally important for national security and for the success of a nation at war in World War II, for their citizens to be literate. And the reason it was very important for the citizens to be literate was that soldiers who could read could follow orders better, and they could help a nation at war. So they could read instructions, they could fix technologies, and they could just do a lot more if they were able to read and write. And World War II, if you know much about the history of computing, also was kind of the origin of digital and electronic computing. This was a time when computing was really started in the US, Germany, and England in particular. And the first kind of computers that we might recognize as modern computers were developed in World War II. So again, here are these same pictures. So now I'm not featuring just the women involved, but the computers themselves. So, so this is the Colossus, which was a major computer in the UK at the time, and then the ENIAC in the United States. And these computers were used to help the war effort, in that they were used to calculate ballistic trajectories, so how far the weapons would shoot and where they would end up, in order to create, better accuracy in fighting, and also for code breaking, to get access to the Germans' code. So at this time, nations wanted technological skills combined with literacy skills. This was really the best for nations, for their citizenry, for them to have both of these things together. So here's the third part of my talk. Soon after World War II, we see arguments for everyone to learn to code in the United States. And here's the first one that I've been able to find, which is from George Forsyth at Stanford University in 1959. And he's saying that the aim of mathematics is partly connected to computer science. So as you may know, computer science often came out of math departments. There was no original computer science department at universities. In most places, it emerged out of math, sometimes out of engineering, but mostly out of math. So, so he's saying that we should be doing programming in mathematics courses at Stanford. So that's the first that I've seen from the 1950s, but really this starts to pick up in the 1960s, when the technologies are much more developed, when computers are starting to be lots of different places and universities and in different countries, and so they're just much more available. And so this argument that people should learn how to program becomes much more important, and programming becomes much more central to the ways that that life was happening in the 1960s as well. So here, this is a quote from Alan Perlis at Carnegie Tech from 1961. So Alan Perlis, Carnegie Tech is in Pittsburgh, which is one reason why I'm interested in this, but Pittsburgh was really an important place for this. Carnegie Tech is now Carnegie Mellon University, which is literally right over here for me. And this is what Alan Perlis said. The first student contact with the computer should be at the earliest time possible in the student's freshman year. This contact should be analytical and not purely descriptive, and each student during this first course should program and run, or have run for him, a large number of problems on the computer. This course should share with mathematics and English the responsibility of developing an operational literacy. So he's starting to use the word literacy here as like a very foundational skill that undergraduates need to learn. And it's literacy in math and in English too, our language classes, which is interesting to me, of course, as an English professor. So he says, maybe for liberal arts, you could delay this to the sophomore year, but it certainly deserves inclusion in such a program because of the universal relevance of the computer to our times. And this is in 1961. So the context of how universal computers are in 1961, certainly they have become more universal to our lives now in 2021. And at this time, as I said, there were very few universities in the US that had computers, although Carnegie Tech was one of those universities. So here's Thomas Kurtz and John Kemeny, and they're the developers of the BASIC programming language, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Many of you may have learned on BASIC, or you may be at least knowing a little bit of BASIC. Certainly, these are my first memories of programming, was with BASIC in the 1980s. But the BASIC was developed in the 1960s on the Dartmouth College campus, which is in New Hampshire in the northern part of the United States, in a small liberal arts school, not a research-centered university. And Thomas Kurtz and John Kemeny were both mathematicians. They were in the math department. And this is what they said in 1968 when they were writing about their development of both the basic programming language and the Dartmouth time-sharing system. So when they developed BASIC, they were very interested in a language that would be more accessible than Fortran at the time, which was the most prominent language that most people used at the time. They wanted something that was easier, that was more based in English, because it was a language that more general students would understand. And then they realized, though, that they couldn't just do batch computing. They had to have time sharing with their computing, which means that they had to have people not just, take a bunch of punch cards, put them in, wait hours for their result, get it back, realize they did something wrong, change it, go back again. Like, this process was fine for researchers because they really wanted to find an answer to something. But for students who were just trying out, were likely to make a lot of mistakes, they recognized that this would be a very difficult thing for students to tolerate and to really want to do. They weren't going to write up a bunch of cards, batch them, wait, etc. By that point, they would just say, forget it, I'm done, I don't want to learn. And so time sharing was really critical to what to their whole design of accessibility in computers. And so the Dartmouth time sharing system and BASIC were developed together and were meant to work together. Now, BASIC has come further, but Dartmouth time sharing, actually the technologies from that then were integrated in other time sharing systems throughout the 60s and 70s. So this is what Kemeny and Kurtz said in 1968 when they were writing about their process. The primary goal motivating our development of DTSS was the conviction that knowledge about computers and computing must be an essential part of liberal education. Science and engineering students obviously need to know about computing in order to carry on their work. But we felt exposure to computing and its practice, its powers and limitations must also be extended to non-science students, many of whom will be later in decision-making roles in business, industry, and government. The administration and the Board of Trustees of Dartmouth gave us their full support as they too realized and accepted the goal of universal computer training for liberal arts students. So here, the language here, at least in English, has a lot of echoes to what Perlis said in 1961, which is the universality of the computer. That is, we live in code. There's computers everywhere in the 1960s. This became much more obvious. And then also, the fact that Kurtz and Kemeny really wanted people who were later making decisions, that is politicians, presidents, congressmen, leaders in business, they wanted them to know something about computers because they knew that people would need to pass laws about computers. They would need to form businesses that used computers. And so even if they weren't actually being the specialists doing the programming, then it was really important for them to be able to understand a little bit about how computers work. And at that time, at least, the only way that computers worked was for you to program them because the interfaces were not as developed. So this is a computer that you may recognize. This is Clementina, which was the first computer in Argentina, which was operational in 1961. And it was a Ferranti computer installed at the Calculus Institute. And Manuel Sadowski was the one who brought it here. So this was also, as I said, this is a time in the 1960s when computers were showing up everywhere, but these are also room-sized computers that were only available to specialists. They required lots of special training in order to know how to work with them. And so this was the coding manual for Clementina used autocode. And I won't read this, I'll let you read this yourself, but this is an excerpt from the newsletter of the Calculus Institute from 1961, where they were saying that they held an intensive course on automatic programming. So this was the idea that, you know, you made the computer do things and it would automatically do stuff. And autocode was the name of the language. The object of the course was to train attendants in the use of the school's electronic computer through the programming procedure called autocode. So this was, again, it was a kind of simple introduction to complex systems of programming and trying to do massive training in order to get more and more people to be able to program these computers. Okay, so the 1970s, we're moving on to the next decade here. And here in the United States, at least, computing in the 1970s took on a kind of hippie vibe, along with increasing government and corporate use of computers. So this is the cover of a self-published book by Ted Nelson, which has come to be a little bit of a cult status sort of thing that people refer to now as being influential, but it's very, you can see from the fist there that it's against the man, and the man at the time was IBM. And so this was IBM globally was the company that was, you know, kind of selling most of the computers, although there were other computers. And so there was a fight against, even then, a kind of elitism in the ways that only this stratum of people are able to program. And so we need to fight against the fact that only certain kinds of people are programming. And so this kind of certain kinds of people being the elite programming, that really ended up, that started in the 1970s. Seymour Papert shows up in the 1960s and 70s. This may be somebody you know. He was the developer of the Logo programming language. He's from South Africa, and so I remember this from my early days in the 1980s, programming the turtle. You can see the little triangle, which was the turtle, making stars and shapes and things like that. And so you could learn basic things like loops and things like this in a graphical way, which BASIC was not well equipped to do. And so Seymour Papert was very focused on younger kids and having younger kids learn how to do programming, whereas Kemeny and Kurtz were more interested in undergraduates and others. So here, this picture of Seymour Papert shows a turtle. That thing that he's with there is the turtle. It's a physical turtle that you could program to go across the floor, and was basically like a robot, and then was a translation of the turtle on the screen. Another major figure in the 1970s was Alan Kay at Xerox PARC in California in the United States in 1974. That's this picture right here. He developed the language Smalltalk, which was another kind of revolutionary language. It's not used as much anymore, but in terms of object orientation and the ways that it organized information. And part of that was for accessibility. Alan Kay was very interested in computers for children. He talked about a computer called Kitty Comp, he also was very interested in portable computers or laptops, as we now call them, at least in English. But at the time in the 1970s, people thought he was crazy, because why would you want a computer to yourself? And why would you want to carry around a computer? All right, in the 1980s, let me just stop and look at the chat if there's anything here. I think so, okay. Yes, and the mouse too. A lot of things came out of Xerox, although Doug Engelbart was one of the original developers of the mouse, and Xerox PARC stole a bunch of his employees. Okay, so the 1980s, you see so this is an ad from the 1980s in the United States, and I find it very interesting. This is just a scan that I made of I think it's maybe Science magazine, I can't remember. But on this side, you see the very professional, the computer for the professional, and you see a guy, you know, he's got his tie and he's very professional. And then on the other side, you see personal computing, start your own revolution. And so these kinds of different ideas about what computing is for were kind of operating at the same time in a little bit of conflict. In the United States, at least, computers became popular culture in the 1980s. So they were featured in some 1960s, 1970s movies that were kind of scary, big computers. But in the 1980s, they ended up featuring games, cool graphics, and were kind of exciting. So here's a couple very popular movies from the 1980s, War Games and Tron, which are still good movies. And then here's another ad for the famous Apple II, which was a computer that really changed a lot of things in the United States because they were very popular. They were used in elementary school classrooms, including my own elementary school classroom in the 1980s. And in their big explanation here on the right side of this page, it describes all of the things that the computer can do for you, but one of the things that the computer can do for you is that you can program it. And they needed to have a long explanation about what a computer could do because one, they were very expensive, and then two, nobody knew what to do with a personal computer. This wasn't something that was so common. So the ads had to say, look, you can play games with it, and you can do your budget with it, and you can program with it, and you can do these kinds of things. And the other thing I want to draw your attention to in this ad, which is very common in the 1980s, is the man is programming here, looking very smart and studious, and the woman is cutting vegetables in the kitchen and looking over at the man and not programming. So this is BASIC in Apple II. So Kemeny and Kurtz, because they were researchers and they were interested in open educational resources and sharing their all of their work, they made BASIC free and open so that other people could develop it and license it. And so for that reason, besides the fact that BASIC was a useful language in a lot of other ways, BASIC then was written, was taken by Bill Gates and Paul Allen and rewritten and used in a lot of different contexts then beginning in the early 80s. And so it ended up also being on a lot of the computers that were personal computers in the 1980s that came home in US households at least. And so that's what a lot of people who grew up in the 1980s, like myself, started programming on. So in 1983, to bring this back to literacy, we saw a publication called A Nation at Risk. And in the United States, this is when Ronald Reagan was president. It was a kind of move towards conservatism, small government, and local control of education. And this particular, we were also at a Cold War with Russia, or with the USSR. So this particular report was very influential. It was controversial. It was a government report. And what it basically said is that literacy education in the United States is terrible. They blamed the teachers for that literacy education, which is one of the reasons why it was very controversial in the United States. But they said that literacy education in the United States needed to improve significantly so that we can compete with Japan, Germany, Korea, and the USSR in 1983. Otherwise, these countries are going to leave us in the dust, and the United States will not be a power anymore. And so this kind of jump-started more literacy campaigns, and this also jump-started the use of computers in classrooms, such as my own, the Apple II, in the 1980s, that they were trying to combine literacy and technological skills for citizens so that we would all grow up and we would be able to be powerful United States citizens and overpower Japanese and Soviet citizens. So then move on to the 1990s. And the 1990s is the birth of the World Wide Web. And so this is Tim Berners-Lee. As you may know, the development of the World Wide Web began in Switzerland at CERN with Tim Berners-Lee starting a kind of local directory. And this is very basic HTML code, which I'm sure you recognize. The World Wide Web was where many people coming of age in the 1990s first learned about simple coding. And then, you know, in Argentina, from what I saw, most software was imported from the US, but end users were able to program with it, in part because there was facility with English and they could do they could use the software. Cyber cafes were a really common way to access the internet in Argentina in the 1990s too. So these are the personal computers per 1,000 people in Latin America and the US. So the US definitely had a lot more computers per capita, but Argentina had quite a few too. Okay, and then there was also a tradition of more accessible languages in the tradition of BASIC. So here's Python, where Guido van Rossum, who is the developer, the original developer of Python, which is another language you may be quite familiar with, he says, in 1999, we compare mass ability to read and write software with mass literacy and predict equally pervasive changes to society. Hardware is now sufficiently fast and cheap to make mass computer education possible. The next big change will happen when most computer users have the knowledge and power to create and modify software. So here he is saying the mass ability to read and write software is similar to mass literacy. And again, we see that same language of being able to program is like reading and writing, and that this will enable a lot more power and interesting ideas to circulate. So now we're skipping a few years from the 1990s. There is still a national push to teach young people programming, as I opened up this talk with. So this is a more recent chart by code.org where they're looking at US competitiveness. So I'm still thinking about the nation at risk and the legacy of World War II and the idea that technological skills in citizens are very useful to the nation. So this is America's untapped opportunity that if we had more skills here, then people would be able to have better jobs and be able to help the US compete. This is also similarly going on in Argentina with a push for access to the internet and also teaching programming to young people. And so as reflected in this very conference, right, that there is a kind of motivation and a lot of inertia, a lot of energy around teaching people, especially young people, how to program. So it's not just for undergraduates or older people, not just a professional skill, but it's for lots of different reasons. And it's good to start young, just like we start young with reading and writing and basic literacy. So again, this is Fundación Sadowski and all of the different kinds of books that are geared towards teaching young people programming. And there's very similar kinds of things all over the place, but these look really great. And there's a moral obligation to have more people programming. So this is something that lots of people are talking about now, the fact that tech companies have become very powerful. They're still being, controlled by very elite people. Usually these people are of elite classes in the United States in particular. In California, places like Microsoft, Facebook, Google, et cetera. And so there's on the left, we see a book called Algorithms of Repression by a US education scholar, Sophia Noble, who's talking about how Google sort of presents different groups of people different ways, and in ways that are very oppressive to minoritized groups in the world and in the United States. And then on the other hand, we have Mozilla, which is an open source software company trying to promote responsible computer science. And this is something I think your keynote speaker from yesterday was talking about too. There's a lot of emphasis on responsible artificial intelligence and responsible computer science, and for very good reason, because a lot of it has been irresponsible. So these are, again, some of the reasons, as I stated at the beginning, for why people are teaching coding. We live in code, there's computational thinking, there's creativity in code, and then equity and access is still quite important. So maybe you have your own reasons for wanting to teach coding as a teacher, which I would be interested to hear too in the Q&A. And then there's a number of people who are doing this work in really wonderful, creative ways that are emphasizing equity and access and all of the things that I think we might want about this. And so I'm just featuring one here, partly because she's from Argentina, which is Dr. Marina Umashi-Berz, whose work I really deeply admire. And she's written a few books too that I think are really wonderful about teaching coding to young people. And her most recent one, I think, is just out now, about how children learn human values through programming. And she talks too about coding as a kind of form of play and games, and she makes really cool robots too. So as I said at the beginning of the talk, my goal was to kind of give a picture of the kind of longer tradition of literacy and of people promoting coding that you're operating in as teachers of computer science. So this is the long tradition of coding and literacy that you are teaching in. So thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Annette, por la excelente charla.
Gracias.
Acá fueron llegando algunas preguntas a medida que hacías tu presentación, así que te las voy a ir pasando, las voy a ir leyendo y las intérpretes te las irán traduciendo. La primera es, bueno, ¿cómo se organizan las asignaturas de informática en las escuelas secundarias de Estados Unidos? Y si existe al menos una asignatura informática por año.
A computational subject per year, or I think I missed the last part of that question.
Sí, preguntan, sí, si hay una por año en la escuela secundaria, digamos, una materia a lo largo de toda la...
Okay, well, I can say a little bit about how computer science is being taught in K through 12 education here in the United States. I think that's the question, right? How it's organized. Yeah, okay, thank you. So it is still, I think, very focused on advanced computer science. So we have what are called advanced placement classes, or AP classes, and computer science is taught at that level. That's at the high school level, so very upper level. But those are often only available at very large high schools, or high schools with a lot of resources. There are other computer science teachers who are working on teaching at lower grades. So there's often, say, one computer science teacher for a whole school. So for instance, my children go to a school that has 700 children. This is an elementary school. It's a very large one. And they have one computer science teacher. So they have 1 hour of computer science per week. And this is quite common. And part of the challenge, I think there's a lot of desire to have computer science integrated into other parts of the curriculum into the sciences, even into English, and integrating it into English is something that I've been working on and have been more interested in too. But one of the challenges with that is that in the United States, teachers don't make a great deal of money, and computer scientists do make a lot of money. And so if somebody is very good at computer science, if they love teaching, then they may go into teaching. But a lot of times then it's very difficult for schools to keep computer science teachers because they will often find jobs elsewhere.
Sí, me parece que esa es algo que se comparte en los distintos lugares. Acá pasa algo parecido, incluso durante los estudios universitarios hay muchos estudiantes que no finalizan su carrera porque consiguen trabajos bien remunerados antes y bueno, entran en el mercado laboral, mucho más los docentes. Bien, continúo entonces con las preguntas. Te preparo para esta porque son 4 preguntas en una, así que ahí va con advertencia. ¿Cuáles son los objetivos de promocionar la enseñanza de la programación en Estados Unidos? ¿Cuáles son las herramientas y plataformas que se utilizan para alcanzar esos objetivos? ¿Cómo se los implementará concretamente en la práctica? Y por último, ¿cómo se evaluará el progreso y sus resultados?
Okay, that's a complicated question. So the goals of it in the United States, I think are, I think very similar to the things that I just said, which are about training individuals. So we want students who come out of schooling to be able to perform jobs. And one of the most prominent jobs that has a lot of openings is something having to do with computers. And that may or may not have to do with actual programming, but certainly being able to use computers well is critical for almost every job that's not like manual labor here in the United States. So that's one of the goals. I think for many educators, there's a goal of equity and access. And so there's a lot of groups that are after school groups, extracurricular groups that are trying to teach coding in under-resourced schools, schools that have less access to funding because, which I think is similar to Argentina too, that some schools are very rich and some schools are very poor. And for the schools that do not have many resources, there's groups that try to come in and help students there have more resources about computing. So I think that's one of the goals then too. And then I think too, at the national level, there is support for teaching computer science because of competitiveness. I think that the United States is always very anxious about losing its position on the global stage. And right now, I think the United States is extremely anxious about losing its position to China. And ironically, we have a lot of international Chinese students who come to United States universities. And so they come here and get educated for instance, at Carnegie Mellon, literally right here, has a very high international population, in particular Chinese students, and then they go back to China. And so there's increasing conversation about that and how that aligns with US national goals, which of course educators have very complex and not always the same opinions about. The tools that are used for it, I think, are the tools that probably the same tools that you're using, which are often free tools online. There are many resources now, especially Scratch is very popular. You know, there's other little Code Spark, you know, there's like 100 different online kinds of tools that that I think are often used in kindergarten through 12th grade education here in the United States. The tools change somewhat at the college level. Python is very popular as an introductory language at the college level. It used to be mostly Java, but I think it's actually a positive thing now that it's more Python for humanities and for other introductory things. How is it put into practice, I think was the third part. I mean, I think that varies a lot of different places. I think, again, you know, finding the teachers, finding the skilled people, the tools are there. And I think a lot of students want to learn, but finding skilled teachers to be able to do this work is something I know. I mean, it's challenging here at the University of Pittsburgh. It's challenging at all of our local high schools. It's challenging lots of different places because the skills are significant that a teacher needs to be able to teach these things. And then how is it evaluated? That's a hard question because I'm not involved in educational policy. So I know that there's like CS task forces and groups that are measuring these kinds of things. And certainly I think code.org is collecting information about increasing numbers of students taking the computer science AP exam, for instance, which is one measure that they use here. If more students are taking the computer science AP exam, that means that more of them are taking it in high school and that they're coming into college with a little more background.
Bien. Sigo con la siguiente pregunta, que también son varias preguntas juntas, y dice, bueno, teniendo en cuenta la historia y la actualidad, desde el punto de vista de la educación en los diferentes niveles educativos, ¿qué aspectos positivos y negativos se observan a partir de que se va incorporando las ciencias de la computación en la escuela? ¿Qué cosas han evolucionado? ¿Qué aspectos se deberían mejorar? ¿Qué pasa con la didáctica?
So the positive thing, I think, is that a lot more people do recognize that programming is really important. And so I think they also recognize that it's easy to access tools. So I think a lot of people know that they can find something somewhere online in order to teach themselves. I think that it's still a challenge to figure out how to navigate those tools if you really don't know much at all. And I've seen that even in my undergraduate students and graduate students in my courses, partly because I teach in English. And so usually I teach people who don't have a great deal of technological background. And so, so sometimes even watching where they get confused is instructive because they stop, you know, very early on. They like literally don't know where to go when they are encountering very basic Python language, you know. So that is, that's one of the challenges. But I think it's positive that people are recognizing that these things are important and available to them. And I think it's also really useful that more and more people are recognizing the equity and access problems with it, that there is what's been called here a techlash from the word backlash in English, which is a pushback on power. And so the power, you know, 5 years ago, Google, Facebook were the darlings of both, you know, conservative and progressive parties in the United States. They were, you know, making lots of money and increasing United States influence in the world. But now people are pushing back on that because they're feeling nervous about how much data is being taken from them, about how these companies are doing things about political manipulation that are showing up in even our national elections, but local elections. They're understanding that they're doing international influence. So they're doing kind of shadow government work, you know, and so people in the United States, a number of them are on both sides of our, you know, conservative and progressive politics, are becoming very nervous about this. And so there's a big pushback now against Facebook and Google and other places. And part of that too is because they are not very inclusive in their hiring. And so they've had a lot of trouble retaining women, retaining especially Black women, retaining underrepresented minorities here in the United States. And so some people have a significant problem with that too. So, so I think that all of that is motivating to people to learn more about technology in order to understand how it's happening in our politics, how disinformation is happening, because people can see it happening, but they don't know how. So I think that there's a lot more demand for that now. I mean, even just this week, I gave a talk on a panel about AI and creativity, and there were 160 people there, just Pittsburgh people who were interested in learning more about artificial intelligence, because there's a lot of conversation about, say, artificial intelligence in particular. So, so those are some things. I think some of the negatives, or some of the things I guess I see as potential interventions for education is, you know, on the one hand, we've got these coding boot camps, and what they focus on is learn coding. Here's Loop in Python. Here's how to do full stack development on the web. Here's a bunch of other things, technological things you can do, programming type things. Sometimes these coding boot camps don't often come with the kind of social support that people need if they're not coming from backgrounds where they already have access to social support, somebody else to kind of pay for their schooling. You know, if they have to pay for schooling, then, you know, they can't. You know, a lot of people just can't do that. They have to keep a job in order to keep their family, or in order to keep their keep being fed here. So because we don't have a significant social safety net. And so I think there's some recognition about that, but that's still very difficult for people to take, you know, 6 to 9 months off to get these kinds of skills. And these skills are mostly professionally focused anyway. Another thing I think is a problem is that a lot of these things aren't taught alongside the ethical considerations about, say, collecting data, about privacy, about what does it mean to design software for communities? How do you design software with communities so that you're thinking about the needs of a community, so that you're listening to what people need, so that you're including people in your software design, rather than designing it top down by what you think is important. So I think those ethical things are still very important. Where I see in, you know, at university level computer science is often, here you have classes that are just programming and technical stuff, et cetera, and then you have the ethical stuff over here. And they're taught by different people, and they have to take both of them in order to get the degree. So now you have to take an ethical course, but they're still not very well integrated. And the people who are teaching the technical things often don't respect the people teaching the ethical things, because those things just aren't fully integrated. There are some people who are working across those things. And I know, you know, at University of Pittsburgh, we're working on that. And I work with a lot of those people, but I think a lot of times those things are still very, very segregated. And so I think the students moving through think of those things as very segregated in their mind.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Paso a la siguiente pregunta. ¿Qué vulnerabilidades o desventajas ves para alguien que no está alfabetizado en programación, más allá de las oportunidades laborales?
Okay. I mean, I think some of it is, I think privacy and recognizing the value of your own data is one of them. I think it's easier to be taken advantage of through software platforms if you don't understand how you're giving up information, which doesn't necessarily have to do with can you code, but it does have to do with, do you understand how computers work? So I think that's one of the things. I mean, I think too, there's a lot of things you can do. I mean, just creatively, I think about, I've been learning more about how to do fun things with text generation. And I'm a writer, you know, I write in English, but being able to play around with language and, you know, Python or GPT-3 or machine learning in order to generate language is teaching me interesting things. It's like it's a fun way to think. So I think, you know, learning more things like to stretch your brain is if you don't know coding, then you don't have access to those things. So those are a few different, I guess, disadvantages that I might see.
Gracias. Sigo entonces con las preguntas. Acá dicen que hiciste un paralelismo entre la alfabetización y aprender la alfabetización entendida de manera general y aprender a programar. Y la pregunta es, ¿dónde estaríamos parados ahora? ¿En qué momento histórico? Si tratamos de hacer un paralelismo con cómo fue la alfabetización entendida como algo más general. Por ejemplo, acá lo que plantean es que en muchos casos convenía que gente no aprenda a escribir o a leer, utilizando eso como una herramienta de poder. Y si te parece que ahora podría estar pasando algo parecido.
So the first part of the question is about, like, if the parallels are here, you know, where are we? And this is something I say more about in the book too, and an article version of the book, which I could share. But so if we think about the stages of literacy being first the invention of writing, you know, that writing exists, that some people can use writing. This is very simplistic, and then that writing becomes something that you see everywhere, that it's being used in laws, it's being used to keep track of books, to keep track of finances, things like that. And then you see more and more people learning to read and write and be able to use it. So that is the stage of mass literacy. And in between is the stage when it's only the domain of specialists. And so I think that if we think about that same parallel with computing or programming, we are at the point where programming exists. You know, there's like lots of wonderful high level languages, especially since the 1960s, really a big blossoming of languages that are used in specific domains, that are easier to use, that are reliable. And increasingly more so now, but we're still at the stage where it's mostly specialists who know how to manipulate this particular technology. We're not at that stage where there might be mass literacy. And this is what Guido van Rossum was referring to, is that if we move to that stage where there's mass literacy in programming, then you know, what's possible then? We might have all new means of, you know, sharing information and communicating and creativity and things like that. And I do think that we see some of that starting just through the sharing of very interesting resources for playing around with, say, language on the web. You know, you can find a lot of different you know, right now is, for instance, NaNoGenmo, which I'm not sure if you all have heard of this or know about it, but November is National Novel Writing Month. So writers will say, I'm just going to write a novel in November. And Darius Kazemi, who's a popular kind of, I don't know, programmer, Twitter bot writer person online, developed National Novel Generation Month, I think in 2017. And that is a movement to write a program that will generate a 50,000 word novel in the course of November. So that's something that I'm planning on doing for the first time this year for fun, although I've followed it other years. And so I think that is kind of what we start seeing when more and more people who are not specialists have access to programming. I think that there's negative things in that too, but that's one of the more positive things, that you can see lots of very fun, random, creative things circulating.
Bien, la siguiente pregunta, en realidad es, piden si no tenés algunos consejos que puedas dar para introducir estos temas, pensamiento computacional es lo que menciona la pregunta, en niños.
Yes, I think that's the name, by the way. I'm typing in the chat the name of the person who I was referring to. I think it's a hard name to spell. So for introducing it to children, I mean, I would say beginning with Marina Bears' work is a wonderful place. I love the way that she thinks very carefully about the tactileness that young children need in early coding. So she has these robots that are blocks that kids can do, and I've seen my own kids play around with similar robots. I don't have those, but you can see the videos online. And I think that her emphasis too on the social parts of coding, I think is really lovely. The ways that she sets up different methods of children coding together and cooperatively, and so that she's simultaneously working on both the actual technical ability to code, but also other things that we want always for young children to develop, which is, cooperative skills and communication and collaboration and things like that. So I think that her methods are really quite beautiful. I mean, Scratch is wonderful too. It's great because it takes away a lot of the spaces where I see my own undergraduates and graduate students get hung up, which is, did I remember to indent this properly in Python? Did I remember the brackets, in C++? So there's like all these places that people get hung up on programming, and Scratch is so great, or any of those block languages, I think are really nice for that. I think HTML and CSS is another really good way for people to do things, because it's a space where failure isn't that bad, it doesn't hurt your computer or anything like that. And so I teach students, I begin with Markdown, which is, very simplified HTML, and just have them start to think about what does it mean to mark up something and show that the formatting is doing something else. It's like very simple step, but it for somebody who has no idea where to begin, it's like it's helping them to kind of get into that mindset. I mean, I think those are some of the things that I've done, I guess. I think processing is really good for introducing things visually. So I don't teach graphics, but I think for people who are teaching graphics or just a general introduction, it's just anything that you can play around with and then see a result, I think is really motivating. I think Kemeny and Kurtz were absolutely right when they said that you need a really tight feedback loop for beginning learners. And you're all teachers, so you know this. Like if you have a student do something and they don't know the result of it for another 2 weeks, they've already forgotten. That won't help them learn anything. And especially the younger they are, they need a very tight feedback loop. And so being able to do something and then see it change is something that's very satisfying, I think, for younger children, but I think it's very useful for older children too. I mean, I like to be able to do something and then see it do something. It's a very positive feedback loop. And then you can get immediate feedback too, like it didn't work. And so then you can fix it and then, change it. So I think, those are some good principles, I think, for early introductory stuff.
Bien, acá hay otra pregunta que igual está en el chat, que estaba en inglés, pero la digo de todas formas, y te preguntan si pensás que la inteligencia artificial va a conseguir programarse a sí misma en el futuro.
So that's a really scary thought. As I said, I did a panel earlier this week about that. And whether artificial intelligence will be creative. I mean, this is the scary thing that Ray Kurzweil had thought about, called the singularity, when artificial intelligence surpasses us. And then is able to do things itself. I mean, on the one hand, artificial intelligence is already programming itself, because artificial intelligence is being used for natural language generation in coding. So that's happening right now. So I think those developments are working towards that now. Whether but it's doing things in coding like refactoring or kind of implementing things. And, I don't understand the full extent of it, but it's not like doing everything just yet, but it is getting closer to a kind of the human thinks something and then the program is able to just do it. That leap through natural language understanding and the combination of natural language processing and coding is already happening. I mean, I guess I think, and a lot of people in artificial intelligence don't agree with this, but I think that there should be a line between humans and artificial intelligence. And I think that what artificial intelligence is doing now, and probably will only ever be able to do, is something close to the idea of reckoning, which is, I'll type that in the chat, but and there's a theorist named Brian Cantwell Smith. This is his theory that basically that computers aren't doing what we think of as humans as reasoning. What they're doing is reckoning, which is more of a mathematical word. It's calculating, and that's a fundamentally different thing from reasoning, and that making the leap from reckoning to reasoning is actually something that they will not be able to do. And part of that is because humans, we're very good at being able to change our programs. So we're going to do this thing, and then something throws us for a loop, and we think, oh, okay, I'm just going to walk around that thing on the sidewalk that's in my way. But of course, if you know anything about autonomous vehicles, like they're very bad still at driving around things. And so, at least in Pittsburgh, we've had autonomous vehicles here a lot. Because the terrain in Pittsburgh is very complicated and difficult. So we have a lot of companies working on it here. But they're still not great at navigating things and processing new data and changing their programs based on that. But I see my own 3-year-old able to accomplish those kinds of things, change her own plans and processes in response to new data that she's never even seen before. And that's a very human ability. And so I don't know. I mean, I guess I think that partly because, for technical reasons, and because I listen to people like Brian Cantwell Smith, who is far more technically inclined and able than I am in artificial intelligence, but also because I don't want to believe that it can ultimately program itself.
Bien, acá agrego una última pregunta por una cuestión de tiempo, porque podríamos seguir. Y dicen, bueno, las naciones subdesarrolladas como Ecuador, ¿cree que es necesario un debate para incluir un plan de estudios en ciencias de la computación? Y por otro lado pregunta, ¿qué lenguajes de programación cree que se deben aprender en la actualidad?
Which languages should be learned in like Ecuador or other contexts? I'm looking to, yeah.
Me parece que está formulada, son dos preguntas, o sea que si bien están juntas,
Okay.
van por separado.
Okay, I'm not sure if I understand the first part about programming sciences. and which languages should be used today. I think it depends so much on the context. You know, one of the wonderful things about there being so many languages is that they're appropriate for different contexts. I mean, at least now, because I teach English, Python has become much more important because of text processing abilities with that language and with its libraries. But still HTML, CSS, and of course JavaScript, which goes with it, is very important. So I don't know. I mean, I'm thinking that maybe the question is connected to one that's in the chat by Vladimir, which is in English, so I can understand it, about thinking about vulnerable people in villas in Argentina, people who've had no prior contact with computers before. And this is where I think working with tactile things is useful. So you, as you know, because you're teachers, if you begin with things that people know and are familiar with and that they can have in context, then that's a good place to begin. So a student has to be comfortable in order to learn and grow. And so working with like the blocks for robots and things like that is good, because you can start off with, say, sequencing and think about how to break down certain CS principles. So the unplugged activities, which I saw that were available too on the Sadowski website, that, you know, there's a lot of, I think, ways that you can get across basic fundamental ideas of computer science, like sequencing, like loops, and start with those, and then kind of move on to the linguistic representation, because the representation of language is very abstract. Written language is extremely abstract, and those of us who are literate, it's very hard to unlearn that, to think back to before we knew that. But it's easier. I have young kids, so I see, you know, my 3-year-old always struggling with that. Language is still abstract, and so, you know, why does a letter go like this, and why does it mean that, and, you know, what's the difference between the letter B and an actual B? And so those abstractions, I think, are very difficult for people, and it's good to recognize those difficulties, and so work first with things that are recognizable, and then make very tiny leaps to things that are increasingly abstract and represented through the language of programming.
A lo mejor, no sé si se refería exactamente a esto, pero me parece una pregunta interesante derivada, es si pensás que los contextos socioeconómicos hacen que un lenguaje sea más apropiado que otros, digamos, que no sea únicamente, digamos, que por ejemplo no es para procesamiento de texto que uno usa Python o tal cosa, sino si a lo mejor se adaptan mejores a determinados contextos unos lenguajes y a otros contextos sociales otros lenguajes, si existe esa relación.
That's an interesting question. I actually hadn't thought about that socioeconomic context might change the kinds of languages that might be useful. I guess it would depend on, like, you know, do you have the machines that would be able to execute particular languages? Like Fortran is unlikely to be useful, but HTML and CSS, you know, might be more likely to be useful, because you could have that run on almost anything, you know, or how to preserve your documents, you know, by using Markdown and, you know, having plain encoding kinds of things. So yeah, that's a really good question. I don't have a great answer.
Bueno, Annette, muchísimas gracias por tu participación acá en las jornadas. Por una cuestión de tiempo tenemos que interrumpir acá, pero bueno, espero que la hayas disfrutado también. Y bueno, y para todos, continuamos con las jornadas, y en un rato empieza seguimos con el simposio de experiencias latinoamericanas. Así que bueno, nos estamos viendo en un ratito. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I really appreciate your time and attention. Feel free to contact me on, I can put my information on Twitter or my email address too, if you'd like. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Gracias a vos. Hasta luego.